I turn now to our speakers. We have two speakers who are each experts in a subject that in pandemic times is intimately related to our daily concerns, sleep and its relation to trauma. I'll introduce them. They're going to speak for about 25 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. Our first speaker today is Franny Nudelman. Professor Nudelman is a professor in the Department of English and at the Institute for the Study of Literature, Art, and Culture at Carleton University in Ottawa, where she teaches US literary and visual culture. Her research is focused on US militarism and resistance to it, and more recently on documentary expression after World War II. She's the author of John Brown's Body, Slavery, Violence, and the Culture of War from the University of North Carolina Press from 2004, and co-editor with Sarah Blair and Joseph Entin of Remaking Reality, US Documentary Culture After 1945, also from UNC Press. Her most recent book, which is excellent, I highly recommend it, and the subject of today's talk is Fighting Sleep, The War for the Mind in the US Military from Verso in 2019. And she's currently researching the legal crackdown on public sleep that targets the unhoused. So I'll turn it over without any further ado to Franny, and thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Alanna. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers of these sleep salons, which have been remarkable so far. I'm really glad to be here. And thanks to all of you for turning out at a pretty busy time of the semester, finding time to be here. How is my sound? Can everyone hear me and hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. All right. In a brief editorial written in 1996, the geographer Neil Smith asserted that the time had come for cultural studies scholars to rethink sleep. He asked, what if sleep is re-theorized as a site of quintessential social inventiveness, of gain rather than loss, of political creativity rather than simply responsiveness, of active political transgression rather than simply a mire of psychosocial discontent? I was taken by the idea that sleep could be a source of both individual and collective creativity, an idea that resonates, I think, with the research of the Sociability and Sleep Working Group that has brought us together today. At the time that I read Smith's editorial, I was doing research on the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who I will refer to throughout this talk as the VVAW. I discovered that the VVAW had fought the courts for the right to sleep on the National Mall as part of their week-long demonstration, Dewey Canyon 3. This really grabbed my attention and seemed quite resonant in relation to Smith's claims that sleep had potential for political creativity. A little bit of backstory on this protest. 2 weeks before the VVAW were about to begin their week of protest, the government issued an injunction barring protesting veterans from overnight camping. The VVAW appealed, and their case traveled through the courts at a breakneck pace. On April 21st, halfway through their week of action, the Supreme Court delivered its opinion in the case, upholding the original injunction, which had prohibited sleep activities on public property. The Nixon Justice Department softened the Supreme Court ruling, deciding that veterans would be allowed to stay on the mall all night, holding meetings and discussions, watching films, singing, even lying down and resting on the ground, but that they would not be permitted to fall asleep there. Although they had already been sleeping on the mall for 3 days, if they fell asleep again, they would be subject to arrest. This story captured my imagination and became the basis for my book, Fighting Sleep. I wondered, why did the government see fit to let veterans stay overnight on the mall while refusing to let them sleep there? Why did veterans decide to sleep and risk arrest? It was clear to me from the outset, however, that I could not fully understand the role of sleep in war resistance without also understanding how the sleep of soldiers and veterans had become so closely identified with trauma in the first place. So the VVAW sleep-in seemed to gain its rhetorical power by pushing back against a clinical and cultural record of war trauma that had closely identified soldiers with troubled sleep, rejecting the idea that veterans have to be sleepless and insomniac. So in order to understand what was being pushed back against, I turned to the sleep experiments that were used to treat traumatized soldiers during World War II. Experiments that played an important part in developing our ideas about how traumatic memory operates. So not unlike Vietnam veterans who used their nightmares and insomnia as a source of what Smith calls political creativity, military psychiatrists regarded sleep as malleable and as a source of innovation, creative innovation. So what I want to do in this talk is trace the production of traumatic memory from psychiatric hospitals of the Second World War, where drug-induced sleep was used to help soldiers remember their traumatic experiences, to activist settings where veterans used their traumatic memories to pioneer new forms of war resistance. During World War II, an epidemic of mental illness among soldiers combined with a shortage of trained professionals to produce a mental health crisis in the military. This crisis, in turn, proved a rich and fertile context for clinical innovation and laid the groundwork for the expansion of professional psychology in the decades following the war. Experiments in drug-induced sleep were vital to these developments. During the war, clinicians used two types of sleep treatment, deep sleep therapy and psychotherapy under sedation, to treat traumatized soldiers and then veterans. Deep sleep therapy used barbiturates to put soldiers to sleep in hope that they would awaken, restored, calm, and ready to return to fighting. Clinicians carefully calculated the length of sleep on the basis of the severity of the soldier's symptoms. Patients were put to sleep for days and sometimes weeks, and in every instance, producing and prolonging deep sleep without dangerous side effects was a delicate affair. British psychiatrist J. Stephen Horsley cautioned, quote, "To give fixed doses at regular intervals was to court disaster. In fact, the only safe method is to regulate narcosis day by day according to the general condition of the patient." So the careful calibration of sleep states in this experimental setting underscores both the materiality and the manipulability of sleep in the hands of psychiatrists. Deep sleep therapy was used to rejuvenate the soldier. By contrast, psychotherapy under sedation used the same barbiturate drugs to encourage the soldier to relive his traumatic memories of combat. So during psychotherapy under sedation, which is also referred to as narcosynthesis and my term of choice, narcoanalysis, a patient received a barbiturate injection that set him on the path to sleep. While he was in this twilight state, the therapist would engage him in a very rapid session of talk therapy. So as the patient became sleepy, he would ideally speak more openly about his thoughts and feelings and would be more receptive to the prompts and suggestions of the therapist. During this brief, unguarded phase, the therapist encouraged the patient to relive the original trauma as if it were happening again in the present moment. And in doing so, the idea was the therapist would produce this release of repressed cathartic feeling, what was called an abreaction. When the patient then woke up, the therapist would help him remember what he had recalled while he was drifting off to sleep. Drugs thus enabled a rapid and intense form of talk therapy, and as historian Alison Winter puts it, quote, "World War II became for chemical psychotherapy what World War I had been for psychoanalysis." The filmmaker John Huston documented the treatment of traumatized soldiers, including 2 sessions of narcoanalysis at Mason General Hospital on Long Island in his film, Let There Be Light. Let There Be Light is a documentary about the various treatments taking place at Mason General, and the scenes of narcoanalysis have been of special interest to historians who are interested in psychotherapy under sedation. So I'd like to share with you a scene from the film, one of these scenes of narcoanalysis.
The method employed here is effective in certain types of acute cases. An intravenous injection of sodium amytal induces a state similar to hypnosis.
What a torpedo that is. You mind if I look this way?
You look that way. There's nothing for you to watch here, but you're going to talk to me as we go along.
Yes, sir.
That's all. Now, you're not going to feel much of anything else. You're going to feel a little bit woozy.
The use of this drug serves a twofold purpose. Like hypnosis, it is a shortcut to the unconscious mind. As a surgeon probes for a bullet, the psychiatrist explores the submerged regions of the mind, attempting to locate and bring to the surface the emotional conflict which is the cause of the patient's distress. The second purpose of this drug is to remove, through suggestion, those symptoms which impede the patient's recovery.
Now tell me a little bit about what you're thinking of.
Therapists went to great lengths to take the drugged patient back to the scene of original trauma. When, however, a patient did not readily recall a traumatic event, they would simulate it for him, staging elaborate reenactments in an effort to prompt memory. Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, military psychiatrists who pioneered the technique while treating US soldiers in North Africa, describe the process of narcoanalysis in dramatic terms. While some patients will begin to talk spontaneously once they are drugged, many require further verbal stimulation. As they describe it, the patient is told in a matter-of-fact manner that he is on the battlefield in the front lines. Depending upon the amount of known history, specific details are added corresponding to the actual situation at the time of the trauma. If little or nothing is known of the original situation, a typical scene is depicted. The patient is told that mortar shells are flying about, that one has just landed close by, that enemy planes are overhead, or that tanks are approaching from the flank, and that he must tell what is happening. This narration is intended by Grinker and Spiegel to get the patient started talking, but if the patient continues to resist, the simulation was made more intense and dramatic, with the therapist assuming an active part in the drama as he, quote, played the role of a fellow soldier, calling out to the patient in an alarmed voice to duck as the shells come over, or asking him to help with a wounded comrade, unquote. Eventually, most patients responded by re-experiencing the scene of war with a terrifying intensity that Grinker and Spiegel found quote, electrifying to watch. As this description demonstrates, if a patient undergoing narcoanalysis did not recall the traumatic event, or if that event was unknown to the therapist, he sometimes made memories up so that the patient could have the experience of reliving them. British psychiatrist William Sargent noted that in some instances, drugged patients were not encouraged to recall their earlier experiences, but rather to imagine new ones that were similar to a hypothetical traumatic event. In some acute cases, he writes, quote, quite imaginary situations to abreact the emotions of fear or anger could be suggested to a patient under drugs, unquote. Practitioners agreed that imagined experiences worked as well, sometimes even better, than actual experiences to produce the desired effect of abreaction. It was the intensity of traumatic memory as it recurred in the experimental present tense that was valued and thought to be curative, not the accuracy or authenticity of the memory itself. So fast forward now to the war in Vietnam and the activism of anti-war veterans. These veterans who had long served as objects of psychiatric experiments, like the ones I've just described, during the US war in Vietnam, took charge of the processes of retrieving and interpreting their own traumatic memories, placing them in service of opposition to the war. In December of 1970, the VVAW began holding RAP sessions in New York City. RAP sessions were informal discussions in which veterans talked about their difficulties returning to civilian life and their experiences in Vietnam. They invited radical therapists, including Robert J. Lifton and Chaim Shatan, to join these sessions. Oh, sorry about that. That's where I want to be. They invited radical therapists Lifton and Chaim Shatan to join these sessions, including therapists as participants while rejecting the conventional hierarchies of talk therapy. RAP sessions were intended to redistribute psychiatric expertise and empower veterans to analyze themselves. On the basis of conversations in the RAP sessions, veterans began to develop a profile of post-war trauma specific to their experiences and historical moment. RAP sessions fostered self-understanding and helped veterans to cope, but as this quote makes clear, participants agreed that the healing function of the sessions was not their only or even their primary purpose. From the first, the RAP sessions were conceived as a forum for exploring personal experiences in order to share them with a wider audience. In public hearings held throughout the country, veterans disseminated the memories that they had recounted and analyzed in RAP sessions. So these were hearings held all throughout the country. The most famous of these was the Winter Soldier investigation, which was a 4-day-long hearing at the Howard Johnson's Motor Lodge in Detroit in early 1971. So at the Winter Soldier investigation, veterans testified over the course of 4 days. Over 100 veterans testified to massacring Vietnamese civilians, torturing prisoners, employing chemical weapons, and on. In preparing this event, VVAW organizers had to take the memories of individual veterans and use them to build a comprehensive collective portrait of the institutional production of war atrocity. And I turn to the documentary film itself, which begins with a fascinating scene, a very long scene of organizers talking to veterans that are going to testify at the Winter Soldier investigation about their experiences and asking them questions in order to collate and organize the hearings as a whole. So it's a scene which really frames the hearings in terms of the dialogic reconstruction of memory. And I give you this, this scene as an example.
You might be able to come up with that. I was trying to find somebody that knew something about a bill wiped out in Quang Tri.
Right, I was there.
You got that?
Because that was, we went into the area, and it was to set the example to show that we weren't fucking around. So the first thing we do was burn down the village and kill everybody.
See, that
just
was
to let them know
I got there, and everybody was talking about it when I got there.
Yeah.
This is going to.
I forgot about it. I didn't even remember that.
Fit right in together, because he's got the same company I FO'd for.
Uh-oh. Do you guys see my PowerPoint anymore?
Yes, it seems to be frozen. I don't know if it's the end of the clip, but it's not moving.
No, it wasn't the end of the clip, and I don't see anything now. So that's not good. I'm going to stop the share. Sorry about that. The PowerPoint just disappeared from my screen. I'm going to try to share it again.
And I'll pick it up right from there.
Okay, whenever they're questioning me, they'll have to get me to elaborate on that, because I don't do it. I forgot all about that one.
How could you forget that? I remembered it, and I wasn't even in on it.
Is there something that you really kind of want to say in terms of the crimes and why they happened? What bothers you most? I mean, what sort of makes you, what brings you here? What makes you say, I want to testify, I want to say something?
So in that scene, you see the organizer, Kenneth Campbell, helping Scott Camille, who's going to testify at the hearings, remember a massacre that he in fact doesn't remember, but that Campbell wants included in the hearing. So you see a sort of repurposing of the therapeutic labor of memory retrieval and memory reconstruction applied to the context of political organizing. So public hearings were one place where veterans took the memories that they were recollecting, discussing, and analyzing together in rap sessions into the public realm. They did something similar in their guerrilla performances, where they reenacted their memories in a way that was at times quite violent and disturbing. So I'll give one example. In September of 1970, the VVAW held a 3-day march called Operation Rapid American Withdrawal from Morristown, New Jersey to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And during the march, they would pause to stage performative attacks on civilian demonstrators who had agreed to play the part of Vietnamese villagers. They would proceed to blindfold these civilians, to tie them to trees, threaten them with torture and murder. And here's a scene of one of those reenactments in the documentary Different Suns. This is from Operation Raw.
Get down. Put your head down. Keep it down.
Take him over to the tree. String him up.
Hot damn, we got breakfast. Yeah. Got a good one. Oh. Come on, knock it off.
So in their public testimony and their performative reenactments, veterans took traumatic memories typically associated with sleep states and turned them into waking memories. In the case of the reenactments, turned them into flashbacks, a kind of performative version of the flashback. A term drawn from the narrative arts and the drug subculture, flashbacks were waking memories that had the vivid and hallucinatory properties of dreams. They produced an altered trance-like state during which the veteran was transported back in time. The flashback was intrusive. It came upon the Vietnam veteran suddenly outside a clinical environment and caused him to lose control and behave as if he were still in a war zone. In both therapeutic discourse and the popular press, the flashback came to define Vietnam veterans as threatening and dangerous, and it's this profile that they are working with in their guerrilla performances. Veterans created public performances that disseminated traumatic memory in this form of sudden and disruptive recurrence, dramatizing the veterans' worst and ugliest memories. Demonstrators reproduced the unsettling effects of the flashback for civilian bystanders. It's worth noting that the therapists who participated with veterans in the rap sessions also disseminated them widely when they formed the Vietnam Veterans Working Group, which developed the diagnosis of PTSD and lobbied to have it included in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980, the DSM-3. As historian Wilbur Scott explains, quote, the working group's data supporting the new diagnostic category was drawn largely from the case histories of veterans who attended the New York City rap sessions. So the DSM-3 lists the difficulty falling or staying asleep, as well as recurrent nightmares, as two of PTSD's chief symptoms. But it also lists the intrusive waking memories that recur suddenly and intensively as another feature of PTSD. Quote, recurrent, painful, intrusive recollections during which the event is re-experienced. So VVAW rap sessions shape the diagnostic category of PTSD, which continues to determine the way that we think about trauma of so many different kinds. In rap sessions, public hearings, and guerrilla reenactments, then, veterans and therapists, collaborators, both pathologized and politicized traumatic memory. During and after World War II, the re-experiencing of a traumatic event was a clinical goal, and therapists found innovative ways to encourage veterans to relive their war experiences in twilight sleep. In the Vietnam era, however, such intrusive recollections, which took the form of recurrent nightmares and the waking memories called flashbacks, were perceived not as a way to heal trauma, but as the veteran's most durable and difficult symptom. So to return now to the National Mall. By allowing veterans to spend the night on the mall, but refusing to let them fall asleep, the courts reproduced one of the main symptoms of veterans' post-war trauma, the inability to fall into a deep restorative slumber. In response to the court's ruling, over 800 protesting veterans caucused by state to debate whether they should obey the law and stay awake or break it by falling asleep. As the veteran Sam Short put it when he made his case to fellow veterans for defying the ban on sleep, quote, "We thought we died, we got maimed, our brains are scrambled, fighting for this goddamn piece of dirt. If there's anybody who has a right to sleep on it, it's us," unquote. When they voted, veterans sided with Shore, deciding by a slim margin to break the law by sleeping, turning good rest into a form of resistance. Turning good rest into a form of resistance, hundreds of veterans fell asleep, wondering whether or not they would be arrested by daybreak. In closing then, I return to Smith's question: what if sleep is re-theorized as a site of quintessential social inventiveness and political creativity, in order to observe that when we rethink sleep, we must work to recover an activist history in which sleep has served, as it did in Washington, D.C., exactly this purpose. Further, I suggest that this activist history is not in any simple way opposed to dominant biomedical and psychiatric discourses of sleep, but that the two traditions have developed in a complex way that is both antagonistic and symbiotic. At Dewey Canyon 3, illegal sleep gained its expressive and utopian power by refusing the assumption that veterans are unable to sleep, a diagnostic that veterans themselves had a hand in creating. As the VVAW Sleep-In demonstrates, sleep has long been a site of active political transgression, important to movements for equality and peace, not despite its association with traumatic memory, but in no small part because of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Franny. It was fascinating. And again, I really recommend the entire book to dive deeper into some of these questions. I'm looking forward to discussing this further in the Q&A. Turning now to our second speaker, who we're also extremely delighted to have with us today. Judite Blanc is a research assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. She has an ethnographic skill set to understand unique stress responses amongst racial, ethnic, and disenfranchised groups. She recently completed a 3-year NIH-funded postdoctoral fellowship in population health at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, where she received extensive training and conducted hands-on research in sleep health and behavioral medicine. Professor Blanc has a unique ability to understand vexing mental health issues by incorporating social determinants of health in a way that allows us to better understand mental health, and therefore create solutions that address social determinants of health, which is yet to be done. This is a theme that I think we've encountered several times in the Sleep Salon so far. Her work highlights the need for culturally tailored mental health programs and initiatives for survivors of trauma. And another area of her work focuses on the role of trauma and chronic stress on sleep health and mental health outcomes, especially amongst racial and ethnic minorities. Recently, she co-led a study with 750 participants, which investigated the role of COVID stress on sleep and mental health outcomes, Findings from that study highlight that COVID-19 related studies underline the relevance of psychological resilience on COVID-19 stress and sleep outcomes. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to Professor Blanc.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so delighted to join you this evening. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Sociability of Sleep, to the team for having me, and also thank you to the attendees for coming. I believe that was the right choice to make because Dr. Nudelman really presented a great introduction to what I would be talking today. Because as a research psychologist, my presentation will be mostly focused on quantitative data, right? Showing relationship between trauma, between sleep and resilience. So I am hesitating between having everyone put their background because I just want to make sure that I know who I'm talking with, right? I was told that most of you are coming from humanity field, right? And given the fact that my presentation is supported a lot with some technical terms and quantitative data, so I just want to be mindful of how much technical I should remain, and just if you want to add your name and then your background to give me a sense of who I'm speaking with, that would be awesome. And also now, okay, let me see if anyone is, okay, I don't have anyone, okay. Okay, so if for the moment you're shy to share a little bit about you, so I'm gonna dive in, right? Let me share, okay, English literature, who else? Communication, fine arts, wow, sleep paralysis, postdoc in psychology, awesome, media studies, neuropsychology. I also speak French, so I'm so glad because I know at a certain point, if I forget anything in English, I can speak French. So awesome, feel free to cut me if you don't understand anything. If you want to speak French with me, I would be more than happy to interact with you in French. Okay, now let me share my screen. Thank you for sharing about your background. Now that I have a sense of who you are, right? Before I walk you through this, okay, no, I think there's an issue with this because I don't want you to see my perspective. I want you to see only one screen. Just a moment. Okay, yes, okay. So in order to walk you through this, to how, to the step or the pathway that I'm using to answer or to get a sense of understanding of whether psychological resilience is a protective factor for sleep among diverse racial ethnic groups. I wanted you to get a sense of who I am, right? Because I'm an indigenous epistemology lover, right? I have Professor Alanna, sorry. The introduction that they presented about me, that was the Western, right? The Western biography. But I also have my own way to introduce myself, right? Because this will give you a sense of why I am doing this and also of the relationship that I entertain, right, with the entire research project as well as my entire research program, right? So to get started, I have two full-time jobs, right? I am a mom and also a scientist. But how it all started, I was a survivor of the 2010 earthquake, right? And as you may already feel it from my research or from my accent, I was born and raised in Haiti. So following my exposure to the 2010 earthquake with my then 6-month-old baby girl, I wanted to, and also I work in the field of psychotraumatology in Haiti. And then I saw so much mixed results with regard to the intervention that were implemented in the field of psychotraumatology at that time. So I started asking myself question, how can I help, right? So I decided in 2010, right, to travel, to go back to France, to continue with my studies in the field of clinical psychology. So this is how everything started, right? The adventure with my kid. We traveled 3 countries and 5 cities, with right, in pursuit of knowledge, right? And also because I am a knowledge seeker, right? On top of that, I'm a teacher, I'm a sister, I'm an aunt, I'm a cousin, and I am a niece. So with that being said, I don't have any conflict of interest to disclose beside my lived experience that drove me to the path of studying the protective factor, the protective role, the potential protective role of resilience on sleep, right? And also sleep-related trauma disorders or cardiovascular health. My presentation will be divided into 2 parts. The first one, you're gonna get a sense of the relationships between sleep, trauma, and psychological resilience in the general population. And I will be paying a special attention to racial ethnic minorities. In the second part of my presentation, I will introduce you to a novel, multi-level framework, which includes resilience in our studies of sleep among racialized population at the Center of Translational Sleep and Circadian Sciences. And this will be illustrated through a specific study called Dolmian, to which I'm the scientific director. Okay, now what do we know about the relationship between trauma, sleep, and resilience, as well as associated health outcomes? So let's start with this hypothetical model, right, of trauma-induced sleep disturbances. So some researchers, right, it's an adaptation, which means I found I was reading this interesting article, right, on trauma in sleep. And then I was like, this could be really a pretty much simple way to explain to a lay audience what is the neurobiological pathway of how trauma may affect sleep, right, in sleep-related disorders. And then I added some animation. So the hypothesis is that the individual exposed to a traumatic event, right, is quickly put into a fight or flight response, right? And then this individual may respond with acute fear and stress, right? And this step may be followed by this hyperarousal, right? And which will be followed by the HPA axis activation, where the individual is in a startle mode, right? With increased heart rate for no reason. And if this activation, right, this heightened stress, heightened tension is prolonged and there's no intervention, right? Therefore, this may lead to, fragmentation of sleep, such as disruption in the deep sleep microarousal, right? And then rapid eye movement sleep disruption. Again, when the individual who is experiencing this hyperarousal, this hyperactivation following the traumatic exposure, is still haven't received any treatment or in the social and the built environment, there's nothing that can, in terms of social support or maybe resiliency, right, that can help that this individual to bounce back, then this may also lead to what we call trauma-induced sleep disturbance, such as insufficient sleep, insomnia, nightmares, right? And then, of course, studies show that, when you have individuals, right, who are constantly fighting to have an optimal sleep, this may lead to poor mental health, right? Trauma-related disorders, such as depression and PTSD. In the real world, what does that mean? So studies show that among survivors of traumatic events, sleep problems are estimated to range from 40 to 91%. And actually, so I'm not gonna talk that much about COVID because the study that I completed, I'm still working on publishing the main paper. And so I can confirm for you that this is not different. Before COVID, the rate of sleep problem was already between 40%, 41%, and 91%. During COVID, it's the same thing. We also observed that sleep disturbance may last up to 15 months and increases with the presence of PTSD and depression. PTSD, right, which is among one of the most studied trauma-related disorder, is also associated, right, with the ANS arousal during sleep and alteration in sleep stages. Now, the mental health correlate that is of great interest that has always been of great interest to me when I was conducting my doctoral thesis, right? It's whether psychological resilience could be protective factors for sleep, because we already have the evidence, right, for of how psychological resilience can be a buffer against trauma-related disorders. But however, I am interested, right, in racialized population, historically disadvantaged population. So I studied to notice a critical gap with regard to the influence of resilience on sleep among diverse racial ethnic groups, right? Now, in order to walk you through the research question of whether psychological resilience is a protective factor for sleep, let's talk a bit about how we define it, right, in the field of psychotraumatology. So although there's no consensus, right, on a single definition of psychological resilience among the scholars, right? However, one thing to remember is that at least they agreed on the fact that it's this individual ability to bounce back creatively when exposed to traumatic events or stressful events. So this is one thing to keep in mind. With regard to the absence of consensus on one single definition, we'll see it like later, like based on, you know, how you measure resilience, this could also lead to some unexpected results. Now, let's talk about resilience among racial ethnic minorities and health condition, right? Is it a universal treatment or universal protective factor? Remember, I mentioned the no consensus on a single definition. Some people sometimes, or some researchers, when it comes to conceptualize resilience, they use proxy, they use a coping strategy scale, right? So we found that, you know, there is mounting evidence that continuous use of resilience resources, such as high effort coping, sustained cognitive and emotional engagement with psychosocial stressors might have a toll on the individual's physical health, and particularly among Black Americans. And this is a theory that has been proposed in 1994 by James Sherman under the label of John Henryism. So once, when you hear about John Henryism, or whether psychological resilience could be a double-edged sword for health among racialized minorities, think about they are talking about, okay, this high effort coping that that some African American may be using excessively because they are fighting structural racism. And this is particularly true for African American women affected, where the strong Black woman schema is associated with greater health risk. For example, studies showed that compared with other racial ethnic groups, Black women are disproportionately burdened by CVD risk markers such as obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, right? And for those of you who are in the field of epidemiology, it's sleep disturbance. It's a well-known comorbid condition for hypertension, for diabetes, obesity, and other CVD risk markers. Now, okay, now that we know that the relationship between traumatic exposure and PTSD or mental health in general, as well as discrimination and poor social support, this relationship can be moderated by resilience level, right? Where resilience could be a buffer against PTSD, anxiety, depression, stress, right? Discrimination and poor social support. We know that's true for some racial ethnic group, we know it. So the question of interest to me that I started investigating when I studied my postdoctoral fellowship 3 years ago at NYU, remember, my doctoral thesis was focused on investigating psychological impact of the exposure to the 2010 earthquake among Haitians, right? And then I also, resilience was always included in my studies among this population. So therefore, when I started my postdoctoral fellowship, and then, okay, and I'm discovering how sleep is related to mental health, or how sleep is related to CVD, and I know like how, this field, they like to focus on the deficit model. And I was always in love with the resilience model, which because you focus on positive threat, and then because my goal is not just to observe, but also is to treat. So more and more, I got interested in investigating the impact of resilience on sleep, and sleep-related trauma disorders, and sleep-related CVD, because this is a resilience could be like the path to tackle, to raise awareness, or to mitigate racial ethnic disparities in health. So that's the question, right? That I will try to answer in the following slides. And I also discovered that data is scarce on this relationship among diverse racial ethnic groups exposed to natural disasters and other types of stressful events in the US. I did find one important study, right, that was like exactly connected with my research question. And that was conducted among US veterans, right? When I discovered that when they measured psychological resilience objectively with a scale. This is a scale that I'm using as well, that I studied using in Haiti with the survivors of the 2010 earthquake. And they did find positive association between psychological resilience and sleep health. Now, let's talk a bit about potential moderating role of resilience factors in the relationship between stress exposure and sleep health outcomes in my own studies. Okay, remember I mentioned that my doctoral thesis was focused on investigating relationship between exposure to the 2010 earthquake and trauma-related disorders, as well as psychological resilience. So this small study was conducted so 2 years following the 2010 earthquake. I decided to investigate, right, in different religious groups, association between their belief, perception of the event, traumatic reaction, which means emotional reaction, neurobiological reaction that the individual is experiencing during the event and in the aftermath of the event, and subsequent post-traumatic symptoms and resilience factors, right? So for this study, it was conducted among like more than 100 adults exposed to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. I found that like it was in line. The most important thing to keep in mind, most of my findings for this data set was in line with what has been previously reported. There was a higher prevalence of traumatic symptoms among women compared to men. And there was also, we found that resilience was associated with depressive symptoms. Now, so remember that was in 2012, right? At that time, I was a PhD student. Then in 2018, I started this postdoctoral fellowship in the field of population health under the supervision of world-renowned sleep health disparities, health equity expert. And I was encouraged to submit the abstract to this regional sleep conference, annual sleep conference that is organized by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, as well as the Sleep Research Society. So at that time, since I did not have any data set, I was trying to be creative, right? Since I didn't have any available data set or new data set to investigate this relationship. So what I did, I went back to this population, right? I pulled the sleep scale from the PTSD checklist specific. And then the goal was to, the goal with this study that is technically a secondary data analysis, right, was to investigate the relationship among psychological resilience, peritraumatic distress, PTSD, and depression, symptom severity, and sleep disturbances among the survivors of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti 2 years later. So in terms of the result, we found that there were significant positive correlations between sleep disturbances and peritraumatic distress, PTSD, symptoms, and symptoms of depression and age. However, right, surprisingly, I was expecting to have a positive, at least, even if it's not positive, but the hypothesis was that psychological resilience that I measured with the CDC, the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale, would be positively associated with sleep disturbance. But in this case, in this population, this was not the case at all. There was not even a correlation. So that it was not even possible for me to go to the regression step, right? However, with regard to the prevalence of sleep complaint, right, it was also in line with what has been reported in the literature, right? I found that 42, so I found of the sample, 60.4, 94%, and 43 reported fearing for their life during the event, experiencing subsequent insomnia symptoms or having nightmares, respectively. Okay, so this was also a study that I conducted during my postdoctoral fellowship at NYU. And this one, again, this is a secondary data analysis. So among more than 700 hypertensive female, right? I wanted to assess the relationship between resilience factors and sleep disturbance, and whether this would be waste would be a moderating factor in this relationship. And we found that, for example, like when we conduct stratified multilinear regression analysis, we found that there was an association between ISE, because it's important for this study. You'll see the limit of this one is that I did not have an objective measure for resilience. Instead, I computed an index of self-regulation of emotion with items assessing religious health belief. So what I found was that, so that's why I call it resilience factors. So I found that the strongest resilience factor in sleep disturbance could be moderated by race ethnicity. And among our sample, both resilience factors, self-regulation and religious coping were higher among hypertensive women of African descent compared to Hispanic and whites. Importantly, in this study, we did find that the independent, like when you account for body mass index, age, income, race, ethnicity, and place of birth, resilience factor have a buffering effect against sleep disturbance among the older female with hypertension in Brooklyn. Okay, so based on this mixed result that I observed in my previous research, and also I have the chance of being part of a sleep lab, of a sleep center now, where we are adjusting to a changing world. And so we took this mixed result very seriously, right? And now I'm gonna introduce you to a novel multi-level framework that we are implementing to our center to study sleep among Blacks and Hispanics, Latinx. Again, this will be illustrated through a specific study to which I'm the scientific director. So DOLMIA stands for Determinate Outcomes, Responses, and Markers of Insufficient Sleep in Rural Urban Settings. In terms of the design, again, we are working with racialized minorities. So therefore, we do not sit in our office and then we call them, right? We ask them to come and join our studies. No, we meet them where they are. We go in the community, right? We get to know them. We make sure that we partner with the community, with community leaders, CBOs, and then we survey for, we screen for eligibility, right? And once eligibility criteria is confirmed, then we introduce them to what we call the first phase of our studies, which is that we can also call baseline, right? And then right now, this is still in the implementation phase. What we mean by multi-level, right, approach a multi-level framework to assess, to study sleep is the fact that we utilize, right? We gather subjective data, but we also gather objective data, and we are using latest electronic gadget to do that. So the plan with this study, once we are done collecting our data, beside all the like the well-known health determinant, we plan on conducting statistical analysis based on county. And on this slide, you have a sense, you know, of all the health dimension that we are investigating, that can be divided as health behavior, psychosocial factors, environmental factors, sleep circadian rhythm, genotyping, and CVD risk markers, as well as inflammation. One thing I wanted to put emphasis on is the fact that for this study, in the beginning, there was no measure of resilience, although we have evidence that resilience can be protective against depression, anxiety, discrimination, stress, and poor social support, but it was not part of the Dolmiel study. And here comes my supplemental project. And so my goal with this supplemental project is to, firstly, assess the relationship between psychological resilience and CVD risk, and whether this relationship is moderated by insufficient sleep. And secondly, the goal is to investigate the relationship between insufficient sleep and CVD risk, and whether this relationship is moderated by psychological resilience. And of course, I'm gonna be mindful of one thing, to use the CDC, the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale, in order to avoid the limitation that I had in the previous publication that I shared with you. And lastly, the goal with this specific study is that the findings will inform interventions aiming to mitigate adverse effects of insufficient sleep on CVD health among Latina and Latinos. That was all for me. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Judith. And yeah, thanks also for introducing yourself in the way that you did. I was struck by the slide that you showed that said, you know, mother, survivor. We had Carmela Alcantara as our first speaker in the Sleep Salon, and she was talking about the importance of creating new ways of connecting with community by giving people images that showed who they are and where they live. And so I also appreciated your curiosity for us as participants. It's something we talk about a lot in the project, as many of us have sleep issues, thinking about treating ourselves in relation to this work. So that was wonderful. Thank you. I'll just invite people, if they want to ask a question, to put your name in the chat. You can write question or just signal, because we're going to collect the kind of speakers list there. And then I'll invite you, if you want, to turn off your turn on your camera and or unmute yourself to ask a question at that point. But perhaps I can get us started. So I was really struck, Franny, when you were talking about the quote you began with around creativity and the tactic of the Vietnam veterans to insist on the right to sleep, because soldiers, like so many other professions, you know, their trauma is not extractable like a bullet. That's a really surprising quote from the Houston, right? And so this insistence on the off hours of the body being made visible, I think, is a really important way to think about the question of trauma, which is not a bullet, which is not a singular event. And Judith, I couldn't help but be struck by the way that you took the question of resilience and then turned it to the question of creativity as well. And I wondered if both of you could comment a little bit on this notion of creativity, because it seems to me that that's a demand. Resilience and creativity are a demand on us all the time these days, right? So, lose your job, just retrain and get another job. Can't sleep, here's like 50 tips for improving your sleep. So I have a lot of skepticism towards that notion. And yet it does seem to be, to pick up on your phrase, Judith, a bit of a double-edged sword for thinking about creativity. It can both be really an important way to reimagine what sleep is, and particularly sleep as both radically different from one person to the next, and yet a source of a kind of common, everybody needs to sleep. So yeah, I kind of just wonder if you could both talk a little bit more about how you understand the thinking of sleep as creative, or tactics for dealing with sleep as creative, given that creativity is such a demand that's often placed on us today without providing us any resources for being creative in this way. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting point, because I think that for sure in 1996, I think that Neil Smith saw creativity as a more wholly positive set of practices, and that it's now, now that we feel this kind of neoliberal pressure to be creative, and so the idea of creative sleep might be complicated by that. But for the veterans that I talk about, I think that creativity needs to be posed against military discipline, right? And so for them, sleep deprivation was actually part of military training, and certain kinds of what they refer to as brainwashing, in terms of being prepared in their military training to commit atrocity. All of that was associated with this really stultifying, and they saw dehumanizing military discipline, and creativity was posed against that. Creativity was a way of retrieving their humanity and performing that as even a possibility as against the military state. So I think that creativity had a really different kind of resonance in this this context of the US war in Vietnam. But I was, in terms of being creative when you sleep, that's a whole different can of worms. Like, I'm talking about creativity and performance, but what about really the nuts and bolts of creative sleeping, which I think is what your question gets at, Alanna. That would be a question I had for Judite. I was really struck, you said that that what defines resilience is the ability to bounce back creatively. And I would like to hear more about what that looks like, what forms that takes.
Sure, absolutely. Actually, that's why I'm so passionate about this concept, this construct, because when I studied literature review on resilience, this concept of creativity was always present. And even though, yes, there is no consensus, there's we have several definitions of resilience. However, all the authors agree on that. And I can relate. Your content kind of relate to the resilience I brought up, because it's also, you can feel that through the reaction of the veterans was probably a resilient reaction, right? So they were exposed to trauma, and then they were having sleep difficulty as a stress response, and then they were acting on it, and then they were inventing creative way to give a response to power. So it's a type of resiliency, right? So this is, to me, when it comes to resiliency, the main thing to remember is that ability to bounce back creatively. And I believe that those veterans, they did try to bounce back creatively. And that's why I'm so interested, because as you can see, this was a work in progress that I presented. That's why it's so important for me to make sure that in the future, in my research program, anytime that I'm gonna assess sleep, right, specifically among minoritized population, I want to make sure that I have an objective measure, right, that capture psychological resilience, because this can speak to their ability, right, to cope creatively, to sleep, to poor sleep, right, to discrimination, to historical trauma. Yes, absolutely. Talking about resilience in relation to sleep is talking about creativity. So that's why the work, the research question I'm trying to pursue is also important. And so far, it's a work in progress. So, which means I cannot, I don't have a detailed data, quantitative data with regard to like a creative behavior outside of resilience. For now, it's just, I just see the entire construct, which speak about your ability to creatively bounce back when exposed to trauma. So probably I may have more data, more valid data to share with you with regard to creativity, creative sleep, in relation to psychological resilience when I'm done with this supplemental project that I am implementing. But you can already have in mind that the fact that you can make use of your personal attributes or of your social environment to bounce back creatively when you're stressed, when you're under pressure, when you're exposed to trauma, it's already a way for you of being creative.
Thank you. I'm really struck by this idea of giving a response to power, and kind of connects your two projects. Our next question is from Chloe now, and I'll just invite Chloe to open their mic if they'd like to speak.
Hi, oh, sorry, my camera's terribly dirty. Thank you so much for those papers. They were so interesting. I wanted to ask Franny about the film you showed of the veterans and the reenactment. I was really struck by the civilian interaction with the soldiers, and I suppose slightly disturbed by the sense that they are play acting in a way that maybe the veterans are, or maybe they're not. Maybe it is more real for them, but I suppose it is one big kind of play acting, strange simulation. And I suppose I particularly wondered if there was any comment from the veterans about the importance of the civilian interaction, thinking about the inherently private nature of the nightmare or the dream and how that's impossible to communicate. Was there something vital in that sharing beyond the border of the soldier's mind, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's sort of a really good question, and I think relates to the question of creativity, actually. In analyzing the activism of Vietnam veterans, I always return to this problem, which is the extent to which they saw it as a form of healing to oppose the war, so that acting out their traumatic memories in this public and, as you point out, interactive way was supposed to be a form of resilience, to use this term, or the degree to which they didn't see it that way, that they felt that they were, their trauma was set in stone, not open to modification, and what they were doing was trying to raise awareness without the hope of ever ameliorating their own emotional suffering. And so they talked about those reenactments in the film as, you know, that the reenactment process caused them to flash back. So in both the public hearings and the Operation Raw reenactments, you have veterans frequently saying that by speaking in public, and especially by reenacting, they didn't go into the reenactment flashing back, but the reenactment process caused them to flash back, which again sort of suggests that there's this this way that their political activism is not, in fact, going to help them, and you know, and it's motivated by the fact that they want to announce that they're war criminals. And the reenactments make that so abundantly clear, you know, that it's like horrible. And so, and even, you know, the substitution of play acting for Vietnam people is extremely problematic and uncomfortable. So I've never been able to decide, you know, which side of that dynamic to emphasize. Does that at all answer the question that you were asking?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that question, Chloe. Our next question is from Cressida Hayes.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for such interesting presentations. My question is really about the distinction between individual and collective in these presentations, because it struck me, Franny, I loved your book, by the way. I've almost finished it. It's right here. So I really, in the early scenes of individual soldiers receiving sleep-related therapies, it's clear that this is a one-on-one relationship between therapist and patient. Whereas when the VVAW are denied permission to sleep as part of their demonstrations, it's a refusal of something that is public, it is collective, and it is political, obviously. And that's very different than that one-on-one therapeutic relationship. All of those three features make it very different. So I wonder if you could just say something about sleep as a collective phenomenon and a public phenomenon, because I think that's really important to think about how it's different in those contexts. And this actually ties in as well to Judite's presentation, because I was thinking how how to say this tactfully, the term resilience is such a fraught term in so much of the humanities and social sciences, because I've been to so many presentations where people say they just want us to be resilient, and it's this hypocrisy of neoliberalism, right? I'm sure you've heard people saying these things. That really resilience is just a kind of way of covering over the idea that we can be treated as badly as any system wants to treat us, and somehow we'll find it somewhere in ourselves to bounce back or to recover, and that should be resisted. But of course, we also, in the sense that you're using the term, want to be resilient, right? We want to be able to recover from setback, and we want to be able to overcome adversity, including doing so politically. So there's also an interesting kind of tension between the individual and the collective in this work too, right? Like, how do we become more resilient, but not just through individual therapeutic measures, but through what I take it you're also interested in, a kind of collective action. So yeah, that's the question, is about the relationship between the individual and the collective.
Yeah, I'll just say collective sleep is something that we don't engage in very often. You know, we don't do very much. And in terms of, you know, sleeping creatively, it's obviously something that we should try, and people try it mostly when they stage occupations.
Yes.
I'm really interested in the occupation as a protest form. That you can't have an occupation unless you stay overnight, unless you have permission to stay overnight with a huge lot of people in public space. And there are lots of different kinds of prohibitions, structural and emotional and psychological, against doing that, right? And so it was extremely important, in my view, that the Vietnam Veterans Against the War took a stand against this, this demand that they not sleep together in public. And that they, in doing that, they, as you know, they repositioned sleep. They brought it into the collective public realm, and that's where they could imagine or gesture towards sound sleep, right? So that it was, it's really the only place in their, you know, sleep oeuvre that I can find that they said, yes, sound sleep is possible when we do it together. And in their arguments in court, they tied that to the problem of homelessness or the unhoused. They said, you know, one of the reasons that we need to be able to sleep on the National Mall is because a lot of us lack housing. And so that was, again, you know, the privatization of trauma was tied to the question of precarity.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Judith, did you want to speak to this issue of resilience?
Yes, I believe the question was about the individual and collective aspect of sleeping creatively. Sorry, I'm still here. So, do you need something? Sorry about that. No. I'm on a Zoom meeting.
We're keeping you after hours. Sorry, Judith.
Okay, sorry about that. It's okay. Yeah, definitely. In my research program, I always try to put emphasis on both levels. You cannot, although resilience, psychological resilience has been conceptualized as an individual attribute. However, now, you know, research has progressively focused now on the collective level. You cannot, it would be complicated, right, to build resiliency on individual if you don't work at the collective level.
Yeah.
There's a bi-directionality between individual resiliency as well as collective resiliency. So of course, there is a relationship between both. And in my research, as well as in my talk, my advocacy, everything that I do, I always try to put emphasis on that. I'm not as a clinical, I was trained in clinical psychology. You know, for those of you who have an idea of, you know, how this body of profession function, they always put a lot of emphasis on the individual, right? They are treating the individual because the problem, you know, oh, okay, you're exposed to trauma, okay, there was, and then you're reacting, it's because, okay, of this fear reaction. So we have to build your resiliency. But what I did not mention in my presentation is that the individual resiliency is also depending on the built environment, right? On SES, right? Yeah. We have overwhelming evidence on that. Resiliency is also function of where you live, right? Is also function of social determinant. Mm-hmm. Therefore, absolutely, we cannot promote psychological resiliency in individual without taking into account the built environment, social policies, social determinant. We cannot, in general, that's how I make my, I structure my research program. And I'm always on that, like social determinant is one of the key like the risk factors, right? The moderator that you can work on, right, to promote healthy behaviors, healthy lifestyle. Absolutely, it's all connected. Definitely.
Yes, you did say that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I see that it's already 6 o'clock. Time just seems to fly by in the salons. The conversation is so exciting. And I also just want to say, if you're interested in talking about collective sleep, next season in the sleep salons in the winter, we'll be having Jasmine Pateja coming and talking about her incredible collective sleep protest project called Meet to Sleep. So keep your eyes open for that. So we're going to have to wrap it up. I also just want to, first of all, thank Franny and Judite for just wonderful talks and fascinating and really important research as well. I've learned so much. And Judite, thank you also for making it accessible to a media studies scholar like me. And I just want to plug our final sleep salon of our first season, which is very exciting because we also have 2 members of our research team, Tony Zadra and Lisa Solomonova, who are going to come and talk about controlling dreams. And that is December 8th. I think Charlene shared a bunch of links in the chat. So thanks again to our speakers. Thank you for being here. And hopefully we'll see you on December 8th. Have a great night and hopefully a good sleep.